G'day brewers, Hendo from Rockstar Brewing has just dropped another video on fermentation and common mistakes and how to avoid them. So I'm going to have a look at this video, we'll talk about it together, talk about my own experience and see what we can learn. Stay tuned.
You did everything right. Your mash temp was dialed in, your boil rolled hard, and you used the best hops money can buy. You chill the wort, pitch your yeast, and walk away. A week, maybe two goes by. You keg it, you carbonate it, you pour that first beautiful pint. You bring it to your lips, take a sniff and a sip, and your heart just sinks. And you say to yourself, oh, there's something wrong with that. Sound familiar? The problem is that you're treating your brewery's fermentation like a black box, a simple input-output device. You put wort and yeast into the tank at one end and just hope the perfect beer comes out the other. But inside that black box, it's chaos and it's a lack of control. It's a battlefield full of variables you're completely ignoring. It's the main source of your inconsistency. In this episode of Quality Focus Pro Brewers, I'm going to give you the 5 key things you need to do in your brewery to unveil the black box once and for all. We're going to replace hope with process and guessing with control. Let's get brewing. It begins with a simple but profound shift in how you think. You have to draw a hard line between two totally different phases, fermentation and maturation. Firstly, let's define fermentation. This is the active dynamic phase where yeast converts sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. This is where your yeast is a beast, reproducing like crazy and creating the primary flavors of your beer. Not just alcohol, but esters, phenols, and even those pesky precursors to off flavors like diacetyl. Your focus here is 100% on yeast health and activity. Make sure you give your yeast perfect conditions to do their job cleanly and efficiently. This phase isn't done when the bubbling slows down. It's done when the yeast has eaten all of the sugar it's supposed to and then cleaned up after itself.
So Hendo's getting at a really good point here. As home brewers, so often we just put our wort inside this fermenter as if it's this black box and magical stuff happens inside. But we really need to take control of that process. We need to appreciate that yeast is not just this magical thing, but it's a biological entity, and we need to give it the things it needs to survive, to thrive, and in the end to produce the beer that we want to drink.
Now let's define maturation. This is where the brewer and the yeast polish the beer. The mission here isn't making alcohol, even though that may still be happening. It's about manipulating the temperature of the beer to refine the beer's flavor and clarity. This is where the cleanup magic happens. Your yeast, while way less active, are still working. We raise the temperature towards the end of fermentation so that the yeast are able to reabsorb the unwanted junk like diacetyl. Your diacetyl rest is a maturation step and it overlaps with fermentation. And when the beer passes its diacetyl test, we then crash chill the beer, again manipulating the temperature to help drop yeast out of suspension and create a clearer beer. Treating maturation solely as just cold crashing or lagering is a huge mistake. It's an active, planned process. Steps you might take here are things like a diacetyl rest or crash chilling, or you might do your crash chill in a slow, controlled manner. It's not just waiting around, they're deliberate actions with specific goals. By separating the two phases with your mind, you stop seeing your tank as a magic box and you start seeing it as a vessel where two overlapping, controllable processes happen at the same time.
Okay, let's start to break this down. What does this mean for us as home brewers? Well, this fermentation stage, we're going to want to get our wort to the correct pitching temperature that we can then pitch our yeast, and we know it's going to perform the job of fermentation in the way that we want it to. We might want to encourage the yeast to create big fruity esters, for example, if we're trying to make a hazy, a Belgian style, or a Hefeweizen. So to do that, we might use a higher pitching temperature, which encourages the yeast to ferment faster and will bring out more of those fruity flavors in the final product. Alternatively, if we're making a clean beer like a lager or American pale ale, we might want to ferment at a lower temperature to try and tone down those esters. Maybe as a home brewer, you might be using pressure fermentation to keep those esters down low. It all depends on you and your process, but we've got to think about what's going on in that process. And then, as Hendo mentioned, there's this maturation thing that we're also trying to do at the same time, and there's overlap there. For example, Hendo mentioned diacetyl and the cleaning up of those buttery off flavors at the end of fermentation. So towards the end of fermentation, we're going to want to dial that temperature up no matter what type of beer we're creating. As Hendo mentioned, just a couple of gravity points before terminal gravity. And that'll just keep the yeast ticking along so that it can do its job and clean up all that diacetyl for us before it drops out of solution. And then once we've done all that, once we've done our diacetyl test to confirm there's no problems with VDK in our finished beer, we can then move on to this maturation phase, which means we're going to drop the temperature most often. As homebrewers, we'll cold crash. So we'll put the beer in a fridge, or those of us using glycol will drop the temperature so that the yeast will drop out of suspension and some of those chill haze proteins will eventually drop out of suspension, giving us a clearer beer. And again, it'll depend on the type of beer we're making, how that'll work. If we're making a lager, a traditional lager style, we'll keep that temperature very low, close to 1 or 2 degrees for a long time to let the yeast continue working, and also to let all those haze proteins drop out of suspension. I think these two ways of thinking about what's going on when we're trying to produce a beer, this fermentation and maturation stage, is a helpful way to think about all those processes and to dial in your temperature and processes to get the best out of your brew.
So you've made a plan and you've separated out your process into fermentation and maturation phases. Now it's time to choose your yeast strain. If I walked into many breweries, I'd find a chaotic army. The cold box is stuffed with a dozen different yeast strains, an English one for the stout, a German one for the Kolsch, a trendy one for the hazy IPA, a Belgian one for the triple. It looks cool, but trying to manage that much complexity is a direct path to inconsistency, mistakes, and cost. It's a huge drag on quality and your bottom line. This is the next principle: simplify to amplify. You need to cut down the number of yeast strains you use in your brewery and build it around a core reliable group of well understood house strains. The problem with juggling too many yeast strains is pure logistical chaos. Every yeast strain has its own personality, its own ideal temperature, its own fermentation speed, how well it flocculates, and its tendency to make or clean up off flavors. Trying to manage all those variables across multiple tanks is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, that's a good point. Probably more applicable to professional breweries rather than us home brewers, because we'll have a go at anything. But the more you use the yeast, the more you'll get used to it. How long it takes to ferment, what temperatures give you the right ester profile you're looking for. Do you pressure ferment? Do you not pressure ferment? How much you need to pitch. All these variables you get to know over time, and you'll dial in as part of your process of your home brew. And so I guess the takeaway for us will be maybe we can try and dial in and minimize the amount of yeast we use. Maybe we find, say, an American Cali style Chico strain that we really like. It might be US-05 from Fermentus. It might be BRY 97 from Lallemand, or it might be another liquid yeast. We probably want to know exactly what we're using, get used to that, and every time we use that yeast, we know exactly what we're doing.
With a simple, predictable yeast plan, we can now build a repeatable blueprint. This is the next principle, and it's where we move from ideas to action. We're going to stop guessing and we're going to start engineering by standardizing every critical phase of the process. This isn't about killing creativity, it's about building a reliable canvas so your creativity has a place to shine. We're breaking the process down into key phases, each with a crystal clear purpose. Almost all clean beer styles go through the same process in a brewery: wort production and yeast pitch, fermentation, diacetyl rest, cold conditioning. Maybe you'll transfer it to a bright tank, but then you'll release it to packaging and finally release it into the market. We can make dozens of beer styles, but the only thing that really changes are the ingredients, temperatures, times, and whether the beer is dry hopped or not. They're all pretty much the same.
So this is another excellent point. Even as homebrewers, the more standardized our process is and routine, the less mistakes we're going to make. We want to be on top of what's going on. We want to know how we're working, and it's a nice way to think about it. You're just going to change your ingredients. And if that's the case, then brew day is pretty much the same every time. You're not going to make mistakes because you know it like the back of your hand. Again, you're following your process and it's going to make sense. It's going to be reproducible and you'll get more predictable, better beer at the end of the day.
First up is the yeast pitch. This is way more than just yeeting a brick of yeast into the wort. This stage is all about making sure you've hit the sacred trilogy of gravity, temperature, and pH of your wort, then pitching the right number of healthy, viable yeast cells for your specific beer. Underpitching is a cardinal sin. It stresses the yeast, leading to slow or stalled fermentations and a mess of off flavours.
Okay, so let's talk about yeast pitch. Not only do we want to ensure that our temperature is at the correct setting of our wort before pitching, we also want to make sure that we've got plenty of active, viable yeast to finish out our fermentation. Now we might do that by pitching plenty of dry yeast. It'll say on the packet how many grams per litre are required, usually at least 0.5 grams per litre of dry yeast up to about 1 gram per litre. So we need to, as brewers, make sure we're pitching enough active, healthy yeast to finish off our fermentation. With liquid yeast, you might make a starter and you'll have to work out how big that starter has got to be based on how many cells you need to finish the job. Now, I've heard of some brewers who underpitch the yeast on purpose in brews like a Hefeweizen or some German ales to try and stress the yeast out to produce more esters. For me, I feel that that's a pretty risky approach. I'm not sure that it actually works. And two, you're going to produce a lot of other off flavors in the process. The yeast is going to struggle to clean up acetaldehydes in the beer. It's going to struggle to clean up the diacetyl at the end of fermentation. And it's going to take a lot longer in your lag phase, which means the yeast is working to build itself up. Meanwhile, other microorganisms are getting a foothold in your wort and producing off flavors that you don't want in there. You may remember in my video I did on kettle souring, I pitched too little lactobacillus bacteria to my kettle, which meant that other nasty bugs were able to get in there and get a foothold because the kettle souring process took too long and the lactobacillus wasn't dominant enough. So make sure you're pitching plenty of healthy yeast to get a good, vigorous fermentation that'll see you through and produce good beer that you actually want to drink.
After the diacetyl test confirms the beer is clean, we're moved to crash chilling. This is where you rapidly drop the beer's temperature to near freezing, usually around 30 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. But before you crash chill, you need to make sure that all the diacetyl is gone. That's why it's critical to undertake a simple diacetyl test. You don't even need any fancy lab equipment, just 2 empty water bottles and a bucket of hot liquor. Skip this step and you'll rob the yeast of any chance to clean up the diacetyl fully. Crash chilling is a maturation step that does 3 things. It makes the yeast clump together and drop to the bottom of the tank. It stops all biological activity and it helps proteins and other haze causes to settle out, leading to a clearer beer if that's what you're going for. But then there's a hidden monster hiding there: oxygen. As the beer cools, beer shrinks, and it creates a vacuum in the tank that can suck air right in through your airlock and into the headspace of the tank, and oxidizing your beer. A pro process accounts for this by adding a few psi of CO2 head pressure to the tank prior to crash chilling.
So I've learned something there. Apparently, yeah, pros will do that. Add a bit of PSI to the tank so that you allow for that suckback that we get in homebrew. So maybe you can do that with a fancy fermenter, or maybe you're fermenting in a keg and you're managing the fermentation pressure that way. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult in a homebrew setup to mimic that process.
And then finally, transfer and packaging. From this moment on, your enemies are oxygen and microbial contamination. Every single time you move the beer or do something to the beer, whether it's move it from a fermentation vessel to a bright tank, or a can, or a keg, it has to be done in a closed, sanitized, and CO2 purge system. You work this hard to make a beautiful beer. Don't ruin it at the last stretch of the race.
If you're ready to take oxygen-free packaging of your homebrew seriously, then check out this video, which goes through and details my process for oxygen minimization in homebrewing.